All right, welcome back, folks, to session number 2 of day 4 of Breakpoint. I'm really, really happy to introduce everyone to Crystal Preston-Watson. She's going to be talking about integrating accessibility into the testing process and how accessibility is not just a one-time project, but something that we need to look at continuously across release and testing. So, Crystal, really thank you for addressing, I think, this really, really important topic. Happy to have you host and join us for Breakpoint. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. And I am pretty excited to give this talk. A lot of work has gone into these slides, so let's get to it. So, Reg, I am Crystal Preston-Watson. I am currently a quality engineer at Salesforce.org. At Salesforce, I lead up the accessibility testing and support for the nonprofit cloud. And I would just like to shout out, I know she's not probably watching, but Mary Hyde, who's my counterpart for the education cloud, who's been a tremendous help. And yeah, so I always like to give acknowledgement to people who are just really awesome and have helped me out. This is my contact information. I'll put this back up at the end if you don't get it right now. But you know, I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I'm pretty accessible, kind of pun giving the talk. And so if you have questions after this, more than happy to help you out with that. So this is kind of our agenda today. I'm going to focus, with this talk, I am going to focus mainly on a team that has undergone an accessibility audit with an external accessibility vendor who's done the audit. There are teams and companies that do kind of internal audits, and those can go a bit different. There is going to be a lot of overlap in the information, but it's just easier for me to kind of focus on this one concept, this one kind of context. Otherwise, this probably would be a very, very long presentation, and I only have 40 some minutes. So I'm proud of myself because I got to do some song lyrics in context of my main themes of this talk. So I think, just in case a lot of people to get on kind of the same level of what is an accessibility audit, I think a lot of people may have heard of it, but they may not know what's the ins and outs of what an accessibility audit is. And pretty much what it is just a way for you to, usually you'll gauge the standards of like how your applications, your websites, compared to a list of accessibility standards, how accessible is your application or your websites. And usually, it's either can be carried out, as I said, by external consultants or internally, and it's usually it's conducted usually with manual testing and also automated tools. External versus like kind of self audits usually kind of depend on the budget that you have as a company, as a team. So and also accessibility audit doesn't in of itself doesn't mean that your applications and site are accessible. It's really just saying, well, what it's like, and at the end you may not come out with an accessible, like a completely accessible product. That's the hope, but that's not always the case. So This is kind of the phases of a typical accessibility audit, especially with external vendor. It may not look like this for every single audit, but this is what I usually find how it kind of breaks down. You usually, with the vendor, and even as a self-audit, you'll have a review of features to be audited, and it can be partial where you take a sampling of pages, or it can be full where you're doing a full audit of every single feature or part of your application or site. So you have that. Then you have the testing phase. And again, as I said, it's both manual testing and automated testing with particular different tools. Then you get the result report, and that's kind of like, you know, where issues were found, what's the violation of the standard, like different accessibility guidelines and standards. And then the remediation of issues. So that's when you go in and start, you know, fixing the issues with your developers. And then your retesting and validation. Usually if you're working with an external consultant or vendor, you'll have your developers fix these issues, and then you'll send them back to the vendor to retest and then give validations. And then at the end, there is sometimes a VPAT, which is a voluntary product accessibility template. And there's asterisks for the last 3 bullet points, because not every audit will generate these particular things. Sometimes there's just, you know, the companies and teams only want a report, but they're not going to fix issues. Sometimes, you know, not everyone gets a VPAT because not everyone particularly needs a VPAT, and I'll get into that in pretty shortly. So with the audit results, this is what you'll usually get in that kind of report. You'll get an area of, you know, what was, you know, kind of tested, the area and feature of focus. You'll get a description of the issue of like what the testers found, and then what the violations are. And that can go, there's 2 particular kind of standards, main standards out there. There's more than 2, but the ones you kind of commonly see are Section 501 and also WCAG, that I'll go into a little bit later coming up, and then recommendations. And so if you're working with a external vendor, usually they'll tell you kind of how you could go about fixing the issues and potential solutions. So right here is a example of what you would see. I actually got this from a particular a website from Addie Martineau. Hopefully I'm not saying that wrong, and it's I will share the links later. This is from a audit that she did for airline site, and this is a audit report that she generated. It's a really good blog post. It's called Integrating Accessibility in Established Digital Workflows, and this is from the point of view of a designer. So some companies do want a VPAT, and that is mainly by companies that do work with federal agencies and government. And you know, if your company does a lot of work with the government, then the government, federal, and this is very U.S. specific, but they're also in other countries. I know in the UK and other places, they're also, if you're working with their governments, you have to have your products have to be accessible. And so there are international accessibility guidelines that you might have to go. So but being kind of US specific, because that's mainly what I know of, if you're working with federal agencies and you want them to buy your product, you do have to have a VPAT, because usually their buyers need that to prove that, you know, your products are accessible. So this is something that, you know, not every company will generate a VPAT. It's usually should, just because I think it's, you know, really useful. You've never, you know, I think, I mean, mainly, it's like, it doesn't hurt to do. And, you know, it's one of those things of, you want to make sure your products are accessible. And so having this, you know, ready to go, if you do want to do, you know, if you're a company who does want to do any sort of business with the government, it's like, why not? But, you know, that's, like I said, not every company will get a VPAT, but this is one of the artifacts that might come out of an accessibility audit. And here is what kind of a VPAT might look like. This is actually GitHub's VPAT, and this is actually breaking up by section 508's accessibility guidelines. So you have the criteria, you know, and then it shows kind of the level of, you know, like support of GitHub's particular features. And then on the very right side, usually if, you know, kind of, you know, remarks and explanations of, well, you know, this is what may not be completely up to standard. And you'll see that right here. So you have this example criteria. So the first one's like, when software is designed to run on a system that has a keyboard, product functions shall be executable from a keyboard where the function itself or the result of performing a function can be discerned textually. And the level of support for that is supports with exceptions. And then you see on the right-hand side where they list where that may not be up to standard. And this is the thing of, I think sometimes people think of the VPAT where like the VPAT should be completely, you know, and there shouldn't be any sort of like, well, there's only, you know, we only partially support, but, you know, and there might be some issues with accessibility. That's really not true. And I think it's actually helpful to, you know, instead of maybe not publishing a VPAT that's not like pristine, but putting it out there and listening where you know, there might be some issues, because I think for anyone who has, you know, who uses assistive technology to access your site, at least they have this to go on. If like, okay, I'm having trouble with this particular section, they can now, you know, they can go to this VPAT and see, oh, okay, this is something that, you know, is a known issue. And that, I think, makes users feel a bit better that, okay, they know this is an issue, maybe they're actually working on it, and then in the future this will be handled. But, you know, with a VPAT, you'll have these four categories of support, which, you know, means the product passes the guidelines, partially supports, or in this case where it says supports with exceptions, you know, which means it passed, you know, the 508 guidelines under certain conditions, does not support, which means it doesn't pass that guideline at all, and not applicable, which means it doesn't really, you know, in the case of like audio or visual kind of guidelines, if you are a product that doesn't have audio visual, that wouldn't apply to you. So you wouldn't need to have any sort of support with that. And so mainly when after the audit ends, you're going to, the audit results and VPAT, depending on if you have that, are kind of your stepping stones into integrating accessibility into your process. These are your artifacts. These are kind of what you're going to take and use that momentum into integrating accessibility into your existing testing process. Because mainly a lot of times with an audit, your whole team is not involved. You might have one or two people from your team with the external, you know, if it's a self, you know, even if it's like a self audit, internal audit, your whole team is more likely not going to be involved. And that means you only have some knowledge holders. And, you know, now you have these results, you have, you know, the lay of the land of where your application is accessibility wise. And now you're going to build on that to continue that momentum of, you know, things that have been fixed, making sure there are no regressions, you know, come up, but also making sure that you are with new features and new areas of your application that you are testing for accessibility. And with that, that means you need to upskill your team. Had to throw into some Beyonce in here. So as I said, you're gonna use this momentum because I think, especially right after an audit, after the audit ends, there's a lot of interest, you know, not just from, you know, your testing team and your QAs, but usually all over the org, especially the people who have been involved, and usually they'll tell other members of your team, and that's, you know, at the very most, you'll have testers and some developers that are involved with that audit. And that excitement and that momentum from them talking to their team members gets other people excited, like, hey, you know, I see what they're, you know, doing, and I want to be involved. And so with this, you know, but the thing is that you have people excited, and you have people who want to be, you know, a part of this, but there's not a level of knowledge for everyone. The people who are probably part of the audit, they understand, and they've got, you know, in interacting with the vendors, they have gained, you know, kind of more knowledge and clarity into how accessibility with guidelines and thus work and what to look for. But everyone else kind of knows, hey, accessibility is important, but they don't know all the ins and outs. So with that, you want to establish a baseline of knowledge. And the reason why you want to establish a baseline of knowledge is that you want everyone to have a shared language when talking about accessibility. And I'm talking about the four like kind of core fundamentals. I'm not talking about some more advanced things like ARIA and things like that, but you know, why, you know, it's important to have, say, alt text on images, or why focus, you know, keyboard focus is important, things like that, for, you know, fundamentals, so they can communicate with each other when, you know, you're starting to bring accessibility, you know, into your process. And that is, you know, with the, you know, because a lot of times you're going to have leftover issues that couldn't get dealt with within the context of your audit that you're doing. So a lot of maybe backlog it starts to come in, you know, tickets that start to come in. So having that shared language for everyone to kind of be on this common ground, this base level, is very important. And with that, as people are learning and you're getting people to be upskilled, you want to play to people's strengths. And really that means you want to empower your team to make a difference. You want people to feel more involved. You want them to feel part of the solution. And for that, that means, you know, picking things that I think, you know, allowing people to really lean into what, you know, feels right for them. Accessibility, when you're first learning, especially as testers, can be very daunting, especially when you start talking about screen readers. Screen readers, I think, seem to be, you know, this thing that people, when they first interact with, like, say, I think a lot of people, if you have Macs, you know, have accidentally turned on VoiceOver, and it seems to be the scariest thing for them. And, you know, and that's something they're maybe not, you know, comfortable with, because it takes time to get, you know, you get used to a screen reader, you know, reading back content for you and navigating the screen reader up and down and getting to know the ins and outs of the screen reader. But, you know, with this, and I'll talk about this later, that's not actually something where you want to start anyway. You don't want to like, have someone who has no, day one of learning about accessibility, okay, go fire up a screen reader and start navigating the site. You want to start kind of, I think, at a very basic of like, okay, well, just navigate this site, this application using just your keyboard, and thing that. And so, and some people may have strengths of, like that, and they're really good with like their power uses on their keyboard, so they're naturally inclined to do keyboard testing. Some people, may be interested in, when you're talking about color contrast and stuff like that, because they're more design oriented, knowing things like that. People who are more code, involved, even looking at, some of the more semantic HTML issues that pop up around accessibility, really allowing your team to play to their strengths and empowering them to really, saying, accessibility is this, wide thing, but everyone has a way to feel, to contribute to making sure that we're testing and finding the accessibility issues. And with that, you want to have an open and positive environment. If you're doing a good job with the second, of playing to people's strengths, they're gonna be stretching the knowledge that they're gaining. They're gonna have questions, and you want to allow them to be vulnerable. You want to allow them to ask questions of like, I get questions all the time about like screen readers. I'm someone with visual impairment, so I actually use screen readers, not just for testing, but also for, just, when I'm on Twitter or any other like place, I will use screen reader. And the one thing I really do allow people to do is come and ask me about, VoiceOver and other screen readers, because I understand. When I first started using a screen reader, it was it was very, I remember the first time I used a screen reader was in the context of a tester, and I used JAWS. I put on my headphones and it started talking to me, and then I was like, what is this? I don't like it. and I didn't have anyone to go to, and and come to find out, I was like, hey, this is actually what I need outside of work too, because I can't really see anything, as I started to, my vision actually started to decline around that time. I think it's a little bit of a kismet, like finding that, getting that ticket. But you want to, I think you just want to provide a environment so everyone can ask questions, and allow them to, feel vulnerable in being like, I don't know everything about this. Because I think, given that accessibility does deal with people, with disabled people, some people don't want to come off insensitive when they're learning, and having that kind of open and positive environment allows them to ask those questions, and and learn what they need to, and not feel self-conscious or they're making any sort of incorrect mistakes. And something that is important is you kind of need to champion upskilling the whole organization. I love this picture, by the way. This is cool. Many times I have found that testing is where accessibility kind of comes in to an org, into a company, and testers become the de facto champion of accessibility for the whole organization. And if you really want to make your testing success, that means everyone needs to kind of gain knowledge and upskill on their accessibility knowledge. It doesn't really do you well if you have only one or two of your developers understands what the importance of semantic HTML means for screen reader accessibility. So this is something I think you really, your team and really kind of has to get on board for. I would like it to happen in other ways. It should be this kind of holistic, where it's coming from every direction. But sometimes it comes down to, you know, a few people or a team. And so if it's not happening at your company and you really do care about making accessibility a main part of your, a major part of your testing process, and you want it to be a success, then definitely get on board with championing your whole organization upskilling. So I want to talk about techniques and kind of things that you want to do, specific things that you want to do to integrate accessibility. So I don't know if there's any old school hip hop heads, but I had to add this. So if you do, if you understand, if you know the song, then we should be friends, or at least I'll give you a thumbs up. So the main thing you want to do with kind of integrating, like, you know, really with putting these techniques into your process is do it step by step. Do it, ease into it. Each step is going to be kind of a kind of tactical strategic move to fundamental and organizational change when it comes to accessibility. Each step is going to be a big idea. And you should also know that this is going to be, it also needs to balance with as your team is upskilling. So it's not, I want to preference, like, don't think that you need to have all this stuff right away. Like day one, where, you know, day after your audit, you know, officially ends, you know, this is not like, okay, now when you're working on a ticket, you're going to do all these little things, you know, all these things right now, day one. This is something that you want to do gradually, because it really does depend. It's relative to your team, it's relative budget, you know, how many, you know, like how many people that you have on your team, how, you know, depending on your release, you know, schedule, there's a lot of, but, you know, but you can start making these changes, and you make them gradual, and you make them in balance of, you know, in kind of in balance with as your team is learning. So checklist. The thing with checklist, if some of you are familiar with accessibility, there is some debates of, like, there've been some kind of criticism about checklist accessibility, and that mainly means of you'll have teams that will get like checklist of like, check the color is, you know, ratio is good, and like, and it's more of a very kind of rote, you know, check off things without any sort of real understanding. And I subscribe to what, you know, Carl Groves, who's a really, you know, amazing accessibility expert, really has a really good blog, and again, I'll link to it, which is in defense of, you know, checklists when you're testing for accessibility. And really, you know, again, he kind of, you know, as your team is learning about accessibility and they're upskilling, a checklist is good, you know, so people kind of, you know, making sure that they're, you know, checking all the things they need to, that, you know, things that, you know, making sure that what they're checking is accurate, they're reliable, you know, repeatable. This is good. Like, you know, it's not a complete negative. There are some bad checklists out there, but checklists on their own are not inherently bad. You just really, what really it is that it depends on the quality of the checklist, and that's something that he talks about in that. So, and I think when you're first starting out, as your team is first learning, you know, and kind of training up on accessibility, checklists are really good. I have definitely, when I was first starting out, I used a lot of checklists, but you know, as I was doing the checklist, I was also learning about things. So it wasn't like I was just checking things off. And, you know, when I didn't kind of understand what the checklist was talking about, I also went off and learned more about it. So it wasn't so much of like, okay, I'm just checking this off to get it done. You know, is this pass, is this fail? That's it, whatever. It was more of a way to guide me to learn about things that, okay, it's like, well, why is this failing? You know, it's like, why is it passing? So yeah, keyboard testing. Keyboard testing is, I think, one of the things that I tend to tell people to when they're first starting out with accessibility testing. I really push this. I think a lot of times, even with people being kind of intimidated by screen readers, there seems to be a push to skip right to screen readers. And the thing is that if you're not comfortable with keyboard testing without any, you know, without a mouse, screen readers are going to be that much harder. And keyboard testing has the pro of being cheap to implement, you know, and it's a low barrier to entry, like, because everyone pretty much knows how to use a keyboard. And pretty much what you're doing just a keyboard without a mouse. And so as people get comfortable with using keyboard testing and not, you know, and testing without using the mouse, it, you know, when they start to use a screen reader for testing, it is not as intimidating and it's not as tricky as if you're going straight to that. And I know, and also a lot of things, you know, that you would find using a screen reader, you'll find using just doing a keyboard, like focus. Like if focus is actually not, you know, linear, if there's not a linear focus, you're going to find that, you know, with keyboard testing. And so you would find it with screen readers also, but you would also find it with keyboard testing. So it's one of these things that I think is really a good entry for all teams to get into. And it's something that's really, I think, really easy to implement into your testing process. Automation tools. And I should say, I'm talking more about tools versus actual like automated tests. And these are things like you would find on WebAIM, Wave, Lighthouse. There's automated color checkers. Automated tools can discover many critical issues, and they're really good to use, but I think a lot of times teams become very they think that they can run and not just even, you know, testing teams. I think overall, like companies think, well, we can just run these these automated tools, and then we'll be done. And, you know, it's like, oh, we're good. And automated tools are helpful, but they're not, they're not the end all be all. There are a lot of issues that need human analysis. And that kind of brings me to my last point, which is thoughts on automation. So I couldn't really, so I was like, you know what, I'm going to throw a portal. I'm going to throw from my favorite Portal song. Okay, so I think what kind of starts to happen, you usually come out of your audit with some, you know, regression tests, and they're mainly all manual, and they're all manual coming out of audit. And maybe just let me not just say it because that sounds so definite. Probably they're all manual regression, and I think, you know, with a lot of teams, they're like, okay, we got to, you know, it's like the thing with regression tests. It's like, okay, what can be automated so we don't have to do any sort of manual regression. I think probably a lot of people are familiar with the test automation pyramid. Mike Cohn, and pretty much this pyramid is saying that, you know, the main, you know, most of your automated tests should be unit, you know, like should be unit tests, and that, like then you have your API and service layer, and then there should be a very, very small amount of like unit tests. Well, when it comes to accessibility, this is not really true. So this is the accessibility. I made this. This is the accessibility test automation pyramid. Because here's the thing. So, and I realize you can't see me, like with the UI, most of your UI tests are going to be manual. And you can only really, there's only a small number of accessibility unit tests that you can do. Because unlike with the test automation pyramid, where its focus is around time, saving time and repeatability, the accessibility test automated pyramid is focused on human experiences. And this is because only 20 to 30% of accessibility issues are found with automation testing. Right now, you cannot, you can't automate a screen reader. Like you can't do automated accessibility testing around a screen reader, like voiceover, definitely not voiceover. If there's some with JAWS or NVDA, which is the two Windows screen readers, or even Navigator, which is Microsoft's proprietary screen reader. I don't know of any automation that you can do around that. And that's a huge thing. There are some, and I can say with this, when it comes to automation with accessibility, you can do things like with having linters on for your developers and doing some unit testing, but the vast majority of it's going to be manual. And so that is why you really can't automate yourself out of accessibility testing. And this is, there is a really awesome article that I like to point people to. And this is by an accessibility expert who has wrote about how there's Google Lighthouse, which is a tool, which is usually in Chrome, it's in your dev tools, that will run you can run and it'll find accessibility issues. Well, Manuel built a site that was pretty much inaccessible, but got a perfect Lighthouse score, which really shows that yes, you can automate things, but it's not going to, and there's ways to get, where it looks like things are accessible, but they really are not. So if you look this, it's a really good read. So I would definitely look up this blog post because I love it. And with that, we're kind of at the end of my talk, and I'm excited because I thought I was going to go over it. And so pretty much the takeaways here is that you want to use your audit as a momentum, a stepping stone into integrating accessibility testing, on your team, but also integrate accessibility into your company. I think a lot of times the audit really shows how inaccessible applications and sites are. I think a lot of times people do not think about accessibility because they don't, that's not just something, they don't use screen readers. They can use a mouse. They're not, they're not colorblind. They're not deaf. That's just not something they think about. And after they get the results of the audit, it's striking. It's so, and using this to not only train up your team and really get this integrated into your testing process, but also as your company as a whole. You just do it, yeah. And so that is it for my talk. I don't have the ending slide, but I'll go back to my contact slide. and that's not my contact slide. This is my contact slide. So that's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Crystal. I think you have 400 plus new fans who love your presentation. Both the content and the design and all the cats and dogs. So great. What font are you using, by the way? I love this font for your headings.
Oh, I do not know it. But if you use Keynote, they just added a bunch of new templates. So,
okay.
So it is, yeah, so you can go into Keynote and it's the, I think it's like you'll see it.
All right, cool. Yeah. Thank you. Great. So we have a lot of questions actually. So
okay.
let's try to get through them quickly. All right. Okay. First question is there an internationally recognized standard similar to VPAT? And is it sort of like an enterprise? Is VPAT like an enterprise certification?
So there is, and I am so sorry, I don't know the name of it off the top of my head. When it comes to, yeah.
And Crystal, also you can turn on your video so people can see.
Let me, sorry, I'm gonna have to actually unshare because I can't do both for some reason. Right now, let me.
Awesome, there we go.
There is, and I am so sorry that I can't think of it off the top of my head, but there is. I know in the UK and Australia and some other, like in Japan, they have their own accessibility standards, and that means they kind of have their own versions of the VPAT. So you would have to, look into that, or you can message me later and I can, get that answer to you. But they do. So, if you're doing business in the United States and with the government here, it's called a VPAT. I know a lot of companies will still do a VPAT, but also if they're international, they'll have other things, the other versions of these reports as well.
Got it. Okay, another question is, how do you have confidence that something is accessible? Something that you test is accessible. I mean, there are guidelines for accessibility, but mostly does it sound correct? So do you have some recommendations or tips there?
Oh, yeah, so that something's accessible. Well, this is where I think a great thing is, hiring people with disabilities, especially, and I mean, the perfect way of, having a native screen reader user, you kind of, they have a great understanding when something is, accessible, but also just really the, WCAG, which is the guidelines here really digging into kind of the success criteria, and through there is really a way to kind of learn what things should you do, like how images should work, how video and sound, if you have multimedia applications, and then also just there's a lot of resources online. I mean, as someone who, I constantly, the funny thing is that before I worked at Salesforce, I would actually access Salesforce has a bunch of documentation online about how make drag and drop accessible. And I remember going to that when I worked at a health insurance company, of looking at how they made drag and drop accessible. So there's a lot of companies out here and a lot of organizations that their whole thing is to share knowledge, to show people how to make things accessible and what things look like when they are accessible.
Got it. Great. I think there are quite a few questions, Crystal, around some tools that can be used, even if it is manual testing. What are some of your recommendations, for people to get started? And
Yeah, so even though I said like there's AIM, which is Wave, and that is a browser extension for Firefox and Chrome that you can run it on your site, and it will show kind of some of the, I think like entry level, like kind of like basic level accessibility issues on your site. Lighthouse, which is on Chrome in the dev tools, are really good. Again, just you can't just run these things, run them and then be done with them, but it does give you kind of a good jumping off point of learning about, well, what are some issues. There are some more proprietary issues. There is DQ, which is a accessibility vendor, has acts, and it's actually called so it was like I think world test, which has some, they have some freemium browser tools that you can use, and also some more paid automated tests that you can do, that you can integrate into your for automation testing. There are through W3C, they also have some really good free to use color contrast and other sort of tools that you can run. So I think when it comes to, yeah, those are some ones that you can, I think just off the bat you can use. Also, if you're a developer, using linters, there's a couple really good, especially for like React, and you work in React, but even there's some really good kind of linters that you can use, and plugins for like VS Code that will be, I don't know, for like Eclipse and like other stuff. I'm pretty sure they do. And I use that when I'm like developing. It can be very verbose. So if you make any kind of like, even things that really are a mistake, it can be like, oh, this is wrong, but it's not. But it definitely helps. And it kind of gets you into that thing of like, okay, well, I'm gonna make sure I have all this, otherwise I'm gonna get yelled at.
Sure, got it. There are a few questions around how does one begin to build sort of support or buy-in from an organization on the importance of accessibility testing, because there is a notional cost to it, like of spending more time doing all of that, and I think people want to do it, but what kind of sort of advice can you give there in terms of trying to build a case for it?
I like to appeal to the heart, where it's just, I believe, accessibility is a human right, and everyone has a right to have access to surfing the web, because it's, and not surfing, but using applications and stuff, because the internet and being online is not a luxury. It's a necessity nowadays, but that's not always the case. Many companies do have a legal obligation to be accessible, and that's something is good, and a lot of companies are starting to be sued. And so if you can't appeal to the heart, you appeal to the wallet. and so that is really reminding companies that, hey, there are people getting sued right now. I mean, Beyonce, for her website, is getting sued. Domino's got sued and took it to the Supreme Court because they didn't want to really make any sort of changes. And these lawsuits are not, because I think sometimes people think, well, ADA, Americans with Disability Act, which is what these lawsuits come out of, are about people with disabilities getting money. They don't get money from these lawsuits. This money, there's really, the money is really just, fines that go, probably wherever to get these companies. Pretty much, you just want things to be accessible. And so that's kind of where just pushing that of like, hey, this should be done anyway. People, disabled people are users, and we should care about all of our users. But if you don't care about all of our users, care about that we might, a lawsuit might come. And also, disabled people do have money to spend. And as my grandfather said, you don't leave money on the table. So don't so again, appeal to the wallet.
Got it. And I think one last question, Crystal. What are some great sort of websites or applications to look at as sort of the golden standard when it comes to being accessible on the web?
Oh man, it's it's funny. When I come to with that, honestly, you caught me off guard. Like I usually do have. It's honestly, I do find a lot of, yeah, and it's kind of indicative of there's not a lot of places that aren't accessible.
Yeah.
And I'm just blanking on they're out there. They are out there, guaranteed. A lot, especially if you go to a lot of Carl Grove, who I talked to, his site is accessible. Any site that doesn't have a lot of images usually accessible.
Sure.
I would have to think of that.
Yeah, maybe you can just throw out a tweet, and maybe
yes.
Hashtag, use the Breakpoint hashtag so people know
yes.
What to look for, and maybe you can give us a few examples there. That's fine.
Yes.
Awesome. Great work. Thanks a lot, Crystal. Thank you. I think it was a very sort of insightful presentation. I myself learned a lot about accessibility. I think both the content and the presentation itself were amazing. I think, like I said, you've gotten at least 400 plus new fans who will, I think, soon be following you on Twitter. So thanks a lot for your time. I really appreciate it. All the best and have a great rest of the day and weekend.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Crystal. Have a great day.